Good morning to you all. I'm glad we have this time together. How many of you watch The Voice? A lot of people watch that show. It's a popular TV show that's been on since 2011, and it's a singing reality competition show. They take singers picked from auditions to compete on a weekly basis until everybody wins. And the winner can win $100,000 and a recording contract. And as you're watching that show, you can vote yourself by telephone, internet, or by text messaging. Now, probably the most successful person who's been on that show in terms of selling records and making money is Morgan Wallen. But the real stars of the show are the coaches, the judges. And they've had Christina Aguilera, Blake Shelton, Shakira, Gwen Stefani, Miley Cyrus, Alicia Keys, Kelly Clarkson, John Legend, Reba McEntire, and more. And the contestants compete weekly until somebody wins. Well, The Voice is also a phrase that's been used to describe great singers. Bing Crosby and Frank Sinatra and Whitney Houston and Vern Godston have all been called The Voice. Today's lesson is, during the night, a young boy named Samuel heard the voice. And this sermon could also be called The Danger of Sleeping in Church. There was a Bible story in the New Testament where Paul was preaching, and Paul, unlike me, preached and preached and preached and preached. And he was preaching in one town, and at midnight, a man that was sitting in the window fell out and fell on the ground. I read another story about a country church where there was a Mr. Todd who went to sleep every Sunday, and he snored. Well, the preacher came up with a plan. And he told his church, now, I want everybody quietly to, when I say, everybody wants to go to heaven, stand up. And they stood up. And he said, now you can be seated. And then he said, everybody wants to go to hell, stand up. Well, Mr. Todd woke up and stood up, and he looked around and he said, preacher, it looks like me and you are the only ones for this vote. Well, in today's Bible story, Samuel was supposed to be sleeping. It was night, the lights were out, there was tomorrow to work. Samuel's mother had brought him to Shiloh to keep a promise she had made to God. The birth of Samuel is one of 5 fabulous, miraculous, extraordinary birth stories in the Bible. Samuel's mother, Hannah, promised God that, God, if you'll give me a baby boy, I will give him to your service. I'll return him to serve you. So she brought Samuel to the high priest Eli in the town of Shiloh at the worship center to serve Eli in the worship center. Well, in the Bible, we also have the story that you know about Abraham and Sarah. They also didn't have children, and they wanted a child, and they prayed and waited. And even when God renewed the promise and said, you are going to have a baby, we read about Sarah laughing in disbelief. But Abraham became the father of the Jewish nation. The miraculous story of Moses also involves a baby. Moses was hidden in the river in a basket from the soldiers of Pharaoh, and he was found by the daughter of Pharaoh. She took him home. He was adopted in Pharaoh's house, raised there, and even his mother got to be his nursemaid. And he became the great leader and lawgiver to the people of God. In the New Testament, we have the story of Zechariah and Elizabeth who wanted a baby. And this miracle story was the birth of John the Baptizer, a great prophet who announced that Jesus is coming. And then we know the story of the angel Gabriel coming to Mary, telling her that you have been chosen to have a special baby, the very Son of God, Jesus Christ, the Messiah. So Samuel and Abraham and Moses and John the Baptizer and Jesus, these are all mighty, miraculous, momentous personalities that we find in the Bible. But today we're talking about Samuel. Now, there was a woman named Hannah who wanted a baby so badly. And she had a friend, another woman named Peninnah, and she had children. And she would tease Hannah about not having children. And Hannah wanted one so bad. In fact, when she would go to the temple with her husband or go to Shiloh with her husband to worship, she couldn't eat and she just cried all the time. Well, one year in the Lord's house at Shiloh, she was praying, and this woman could pray. She prayed long and hard. She prayed deeply. She begged and she bartered God. And she said, God, if you'll give me a baby boy, I'll give him back to you. Well, Eli, the old priest, was watching her. He thought she was mentally unbalanced. He thought she might be drunk. And he said, you cannot come to the house of the Lord and act like this. And she said, I am not a wicked woman. I'm miserable. I'm pouring my heart out to God. Eli said, may God give you what you've asked for. And the Bible tells us that very night she became pregnant, and she had a son, Samuel, which means I begged from the Lord. So this birth story is another miracle birth story we find in the Bible, and the birth of a great religious leader. Well, in this story of Samuel that Lindsay read a while ago, we read that visions from God and the word of the Lord had become rare. The reason was that the sons of Eli, he was the high priest, were taking advantage of their positions, and they were stealing and extorting from the offerings that were brought to the worship center. And they were even committing immoral acts in the worship center. And Eli, even after protest from the people and a visit from a mysterious man sent from God, didn't discipline his sons. He didn't correct his sons. He didn't correct, repay, or make restitution for what they had done. And we also read that Eli was going blind. So it's no wonder that visions were rare in those days, because Eli was blind to visions, he was blind to his son's crimes, and he was blind to his own son's sins. Now we can look at this story from two directions. First of all, the answer to the leadership crisis at that time was God calling Samuel. And Samuel was a boy. He's young, but he's receptive. He's young, but he's willing to step out in faith into a life that he had no idea where it was going to go. So Samuel represents hope for the future. Eli represented the wrongs, the tragedies, the failures of the past. Samuel hears God call him, only he doesn't recognize the voice, and he doesn't know how to answer. We read that 3 times he hears, Samuel, Samuel, and he runs into Eli and he said, did you call me? He said, no, I didn't call you. Well, the 3rd time Eli finally figured out it was God calling Samuel. And he said, go back to your bed, listen for God, and when he calls, say, speak, Lord, your servant is listening. So we've got a really interesting paradox here. God speaks to Samuel, but Samuel doesn't know what to say. Eli knows what to say, but God wasn't talking to Eli. So God chose to speak to Samuel, but leadership involves being receptive and expertise, and sometimes the help of other people. Now, Samuel became and was a great religious leader for several reasons. He was the last of the judges. People came from all over the place for advice and judgments from Samuel. And he was reported in our Bible accounts as being wise and good and trustworthy. Samuel also anointed the first 2 kings of Israel, Saul and David. He was the anointer of kings, a kingmaker. And he was the first of the prophets. The Spirit and Word of the Lord came to Samuel and lived in Samuel. So what do we learn about Samuel? What do we learn about prayer? What do we learn from this story? Well, first of all, the name Samuel means I begged from the Lord. So Hannah named him Samuel after she begged for a baby. And that's what prayer is. Prayer is sometimes passionate begging from the Lord. From Samuel's mother, we learn how to pray passionately and persistently. Hannah didn't pray a wimpy prayer. Hannah didn't say, Lord, you know what I need, so bless me. She knew what she wanted, and she prayed for it specifically. Hannah's prayers were not whiny or pathetic or weak. She got on her knees and prayed, God, I want a baby. And if you give me this baby boy, I will dedicate him back to you and for your service. So prayer is persistently sharing our deepest needs to God. Well, something else we learn from this story about Samuel and about prayer is the importance of listening. The first 2 times Samuel heard the voice, he ran into Eli's bedroom. He said, were you calling me? And Eli said, no, I wasn't calling you. Go back to bed. The 3rd time, Eli finally figured out it was God calling Samuel. So he told Samuel, go back, and when God calls, say, speak, Lord, your servant is listening. So from that day forward, God was with Samuel, not allowing the words of Samuel to fail. And God spoke to Samuel at Shiloh. So prayer is not just telling God about all the things you want and everything you're worried about. And we should take those things to God. But prayer is much more than that, and God knows those things. Prayer is also about listening. Prayer is a two-way conversation. And we need to be able to say, as we talk to God, "Speak, Lord, your servant is listening." Prayer is turning off all the channels of our wants and concerns and turning on that one channel where we listen to God. And how do we do that? Well, we hear God's message through the Bible. That's God's Word, God's words. We open our Bible, we turn off the other channels, and we say, "Speak, Lord, your servant is listening." We hear God's message to us through worship, our readings, the music, the prayers, the lessons, the sermons. Listening is about giving time, concentration, and focus on the Word of God. And we can do that with other people, which helps us even more. We hear God's message to us through friends. Sometimes when we are talking to others, we are serving as God's messenger. Or when other people are talking to us, they too may be God's messenger to us. So maybe now we can change the name of the sermon from "The Voice" or "The Danger of Sleeping in Church" to "The Danger of Being in Church." Just like Samuel, we may hear the voice of God calling us, and our lives can be changed forever. So are we ready to hear the voice of God? God may be asking us to do something we might not want to do or never imagine doing. God may be telling us something we really don't want to hear. But where do we hear God's voice? It could be anywhere, but here in worship is a likely place. Here we can get help to hear and understand. Here is where we want to be with our family and our friends at First United Methodist Church of Florence. So are we ready? Are we listening for the voice?